Daniel lived with his grandmother Helen in a small, modest home tucked away in the outskirts of town. The house, though worn by years and weather, exuded a warmth that came not from its walls, but from the love that filled it. Helen had raised Daniel since he was a baby, and to him she was the only family he had ever known. Whenever he asked about his parents, she would simply say, "Your mother is watching over you from heaven, and your father, well, he left us long ago." There was always a shadow that passed over her eyes whenever she spoke those words, but Daniel had learned not to press further. He didn't need more answers. He had her, and that was enough. Despite their meager means, Helen ensured that their little home was the best place for Daniel. Every evening, they would sit together by the window, listening to the sounds of the city fade into the night. She would hum old songs, and sometimes, when the mood was just right, she would pull out the old guitar from the closet and sing softly. Daniel would watch her, captivated as if each note she sang was weaving a protective cocoon around them. Then the storm hit. It started with Helen's sudden coughs, which quickly escalated into something much more serious. One evening, as Daniel returned home from school, he found her collapsed on the kitchen floor. Panic seized him as he ran to her side, his heart pounding in his chest. She was rushed to the hospital, where the doctors spoke in terms he couldn't understand, their faces grave. Words like surgery and emergency floated around him like dark clouds, heavy and foreboding. They had no money for the operation. In a matter of hours, his world had been turned upside down. Helen was all he had, and now she was lying in a hospital bed, her once lively eyes closed, her breaths shallow. When the social worker came to take him to the orphanage, he felt a numbness wash over him. The orphanage was a world apart from the life he had known. Its walls were tall and cold, its hallways long and silent. At night, he would lie in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the whispers of the other kids who, like him, carried their own burdens of loss. He missed the warmth of his grandmother's voice, the way she would tuck him in and whisper stories of hope before he slept. Here, hope was a scarce commodity, traded only in fleeting glances and the rare act of kindness. But Daniel refused to succumb to despair. He held on to the memories of Helen, drawing strength from them. One rainy afternoon, while searching through the few belongings he had brought with him, he found a photograph. It was old and slightly crumpled, but the image was clear. Helen, standing on a small stage, a microphone in hand, her eyes alight with passion and joy. He stared at it for a long time, his heart swelling with a mix of emotions. He had forgotten this part of her, the part that had once been a singer. Suddenly, he remembered the songs she used to sing, the evenings spent in their small living room with music filling the air. It struck him then. Singing was not just a memory, it was a lifeline. Daniel realized that the voice he had inherited from her was not just a gift, it was a tool, perhaps the only one he had left to change their fate. He decided at that moment that he would sing. He would find a way to use his voice to raise the money needed for her surgery. The idea filled him with a newfound determination, a spark of hope in the darkness. He began to formulate a plan. He would escape the orphanage each night and find a place to perform. It was risky, and the fear of being caught loomed over him, but what choice did he have? For Helen, he would do anything. He would walk through fire if it meant bringing her back home. Daniel lay in bed that night, staring at the photograph. The rain tapped against the window, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the beat of his heart. He knew the path ahead would not be easy, but his grandmother needed him. And so, with the weight of the world on his small shoulders, he closed his eyes and began to hum a melody, a promise to himself and to her. From this moment on, he was not just a boy. He was a boy with a mission, a boy who would sing to turn the tide of fate. Daniel had never been the kind of boy to act on impulse. But as he sat on his narrow bed in the orphanage, staring at the photograph of Helen, something shifted within him. He needed to act. Desperation, he had learned, had a way of turning ordinary thoughts into bold plans. He remembered hearing snippets of conversations among the orphanage staff about a restaurant in town, Villa Churrasco Grill. They said it was an upscale place, the kind where people came not just to eat, but to be entertained. And that was exactly what Daniel needed. An audience willing to pay for what he had to offer. The idea brewed in his mind like a storm. He would sneak out of the orphanage, find his way to the restaurant, and convince whoever was in charge to let him sing. It was a plan full of holes and risks, but Daniel clung to it like a lifeline. Each night, after the lights went out and the other children drifted into sleep, he would stare at the window, watching the moonlight spill into the room. It was as if the moon was whispering to him, urging him to be brave. He spent a few days rehearsing in secret, his voice low so as not to alert the staff. His song choices were simple, lullabies and old classics Helen had taught him, songs that held memories and emotions, the kind that could move people if sung right, and he was determined to sing them right. Finally, one rainy night, he put his plan into action. With the help of Julia, the kind cook who worked at the orphanage, he slipped out. Julia was in her 50s, with kind eyes that had seen too many children come and go. She knew of Daniel's situation, and though she was bound by the rules of the orphanage, her heart couldn't refuse the boy's desperate plea. "You sure about this, Daniel?" Julia asked in a hushed voice as they crouched near the back door. "If you get caught—" "I know," Daniel whispered back, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "But I have to try. For Grandma." Julia hesitated, then nodded. "Go. And be careful." He nodded, and with one last glance at Julia, he darted out into the rain, the cold drops pelting his face as he ran through the streets toward Villa Churrasco Grill. The restaurant was larger than he had imagined, glowing warmly amidst the darkness of the night. His heart pounded as he approached the entrance, his wet clothes clinging to his thin frame. He had no idea how he was going to pull this off, but he knew he had to try. Inside, the restaurant was alive with murmurs of conversation and the clinking of glasses. The atmosphere was far removed from the cold and emptiness of the orphanage. It was warm, vibrant, filled with the scent of grilled meat and rich sauces. At the center of it all stood a man, Richard, the owner. He was tall, with a stern face and eyes that spoke of years of hard work. Daniel gathered his courage and approached him. "Sir," Daniel began, his voice small but steady. "I need a job. I can sing." Richard looked down at him, eyebrows raised. "You're just a kid," he said bluntly. "This is no place for children." "Please," Daniel insisted, his eyes pleading. "I can sing. I need to earn money for my grandmother's surgery. Just give me one chance." There was a moment of silence as Richard studied him, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, he gestured toward the small stage at the corner of the room. "All right," he said. "One song. If you're good, we'll talk." Daniel's heart raced as he stepped onto the stage. The room fell silent, the clatter of cutlery and murmur of voices fading away. He closed his eyes, remembering the nights with Helen, the warmth of her voice guiding him. And then he began to sing. His voice started soft and trembling, but as he found his footing, it grew stronger, more confident. He sang one of the songs Helen used to hum, his voice carrying the weight of all his fears and hopes. When he finished, the room was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat. For a moment, he feared he had failed. Then, The sound of applause filled the air. It started slowly, hesitantly, but grew into a wave of claps and cheers. Richard stood by the counter, his expression softened, his eyes fixed on the boy who had just poured his soul into every note. "All right, kid," Richard said, his voice gruff, but not unkind. "You've got yourself a job, but on 2 conditions. Keep up with your schoolwork, and no one can know about this. Understood?" Daniel nodded vigorously, relief washing over him. "Yes, sir. Thank you." From that night on, with Julia's help, Daniel would sneak out of the orphanage and perform at Villa Churrasco Grill. Each song was a step toward his goal, a chance to save Helen. It was a fragile arrangement, one built on secrets and risks, but it was his only hope. And for now, that was enough. Day by day, Daniel was just another face among the children at the orphanage, participated in the daily chores, attended school, and played in the dusty yard with the other boys. But even as he tried to blend in, a shadow lingered in his eyes, a secret he held close to his chest. Every morning he returned to the orphanage with the first light of dawn, his body exhausted, but his spirit filled with a renewed sense of purpose. He would slip back into bed just before the morning bell rang, his clothes still smelling faintly of the restaurant's rich aromas. "Where do you go at night?" a boy once asked him, curiosity gleaming in his eyes. Daniel forced a smile and shrugged. "Nowhere special," he replied casually, hoping the boy wouldn't press further. Julia was his only confidant in this covert operation. She had been the first person to see the determination in his eyes, the desperation of a boy fighting against the tide of a world too cruel for someone his age. She admired his courage and, perhaps against her better judgment, decided to help him. Each evening after dinner, Julia would give Daniel a subtle nod, a silent signal that the coast was clear. Then, as the children were sent to their rooms, she would sneak to the kitchen and unlock the back door, leaving it ajar just wide enough for Daniel to slip through. "You know, you can't keep this up forever," she whispered one night as he prepared to leave, her voice edged with concern. "I know," Daniel replied, pulling his jacket tighter around his small frame. "But I don't have a choice. I need to do this for Grandma." Julia sighed, watching as he disappeared into the night. Her heart ached for him. He was just a child, but he carried the weight of an adult's burden on his slender shoulders. She couldn't help but wonder how long he could sustain this life of secrecy and deception. Meanwhile, at Villa Churrasco Grill, Daniel's performances were becoming the talk of the town. Word spread about the young boy with the hauntingly beautiful voice, the one who sang with such emotion that it brought grown men to tears. And it was on one of those nights, as Daniel sang an old, soulful ballad, that Monica entered the restaurant. She was a striking woman, dressed in elegant simplicity, her eyes sharp and observant. She carried an air of sadness with her, a melancholy that seemed to deepen as she listened to Daniel sing. The moment he opened his mouth, something inside her stirred. It was as if the melody wrapped around her heart and squeezed it. She felt a rush of emotions she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just his voice that captivated her, but something about him, the way he moved, the way he closed his eyes when he sang, as if he were somewhere else entirely. It reminded her of someone she had once known, someone she had loved deeply. "Who is that boy?" she asked Richard, who was standing nearby, his arms crossed as he watched the performance. Richard glanced at her, his face unreadable. "Just a kid trying to make a living," he replied curtly. "Why? You know him?" Monica shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving Daniel. "No, but there's something familiar about him." After the performance, she sat in her seat, grappling with the flood of memories that Daniel had somehow unlocked. The resemblance was uncanny. the way he carried himself, the subtle expressions. It was like seeing a ghost. She left the restaurant that night with more questions than answers, her mind unable to shake the feeling that this boy was connected to a past she had tried to leave behind. Daniel, on the other hand, noticed the woman in the audience who watched him with an intensity that made him uneasy. He couldn't explain why, but something about her gaze felt personal. As he packed up to leave, he found himself glancing back at where she had sat, but she was already gone. The look in her eyes haunted him as he walked back to the orphanage that night. The next day, the thought of the woman lingered at the back of his mind. Who was she? Why had she looked at him that way? There was an unsettling mix of curiosity and dread bubbling within him. He knew better than to ask questions, especially questions that might lead him down a path he wasn't ready to walk. But the seed of curiosity had been planted, and as much as he tried to ignore it, it began to grow. Little did he know, this woman, Monica, was about to become the key to unlocking the secrets of his past. A past that Helen had kept hidden, a past that would change everything he thought he knew about himself and the world around him. Chapter 4. The Secret Revealed. The evening was winding down at Villa Churrasco Grill, the buzz of conversations dying away as the patrons began to leave, satisfied and touched by another night of Daniel's hauntingly beautiful performance. In the corner, Monica sat, watching as the boy gathered his things preparing to leave. Her heart pounded with a mixture of dread and anticipation. She had to speak to him, and had to know who he really was. As he made his way toward the back exit, she stood up and approached him, her steps hesitant but resolute. "Daniel!" she called out, her voice soft yet urgent. He turned, surprised to see her standing there. Up close she seemed familiar, but he couldn't place where he had seen her before. "Yes?" he replied cautiously, clutching his guitar case like a shield. "Can we talk for a moment?" Monica asked, trying to keep her voice steady. I need to ask you about your family." Daniel hesitated, glancing around nervously. This was against the rules. Richard had been very clear, no personal conversations with the patrons. But there was something in her eyes, something that felt different from the usual curious glances he received. He nodded slowly, leading her to a quiet corner of the restaurant where they could speak without interruption. "What do you want to know?" he asked, his voice wary. Monica took a deep breath, her heart racing. "Your parents. Do you know anything about them?" Daniel's face hardened. "My mother passed away when I was little," he said, his voice tight. "And my father. My father left. That's all I know." Monica felt a lump in her throat. She had expected this answer, yet hearing it out loud made the ache in her chest more pronounced. "Do you know your father's name?" she pressed gently. "No," Daniel replied, frowning. "My grandmother never talked about him. Only that he left us. Why do you want to know?" Monica swallowed hard. "I knew someone once. A long time ago. His name was Andre. He was a musician, a singer, just like you. He disappeared years ago, and I never saw him again." Daniel felt a strange sensation wash over him, a mix of confusion, fear, and an inexplicable pull toward the woman in front of him. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because—" Monica's voice cracked and she had to pause to gather herself. "Because when I heard you sing, I felt like I was hearing him again. The way you move, the way you sing, it's so much like him." The air between them grew heavy, charged with unspoken possibilities. Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him. All his life, he had accepted the narrative that his father was gone, that he had left and was never coming back. But this This was something different, something that could change everything. "Are you saying Andre could be my father?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, hanging in the air like a fragile thread. Monica's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly. "I don't know for sure," she admitted, "but the resemblance is too strong to ignore. I need to find out, Daniel. And so do you." Daniel felt a knot form in his stomach. If what she was saying was true, then everything he had been told, everything he believed about his family, was a lie. He thought of Helen, the woman who had raised him, the woman who had kept this secret from him all these years. His chest tightened with a mixture of anger and betrayal. "I need to talk to my grandmother," he said finally, his voice trembling. "She's the only one who knows the truth." Monica nodded, relief and fear washing over her simultaneously. She had opened a door that neither of them could close now. "I'll go with you," she offered, her voice steadying. "If that's okay." Daniel looked at her, searching her eyes for any sign of deceit. All he saw was a woman who seemed just as lost and desperate for answers as he was. He nodded slowly. "All right, we'll go see her. Tomorrow." As they parted ways that night, Daniel walked back to the orphanage with a heavy heart. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the path. He felt like he was walking through a dream, a hazy landscape where nothing was quite as it seemed. If Andre was his father, then who was Monica to him? And why had Helen never told him the truth? The next morning he could barely focus on his chores. The hours dragged on, each tick of the clock echoing the questions that now haunted him. When evening finally arrived, Monica was waiting for him outside the orphanage gates. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of calm that belied the storm raging inside her. The drive to the hospital where Helen was staying felt like an eternity. They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Daniel stared out of the window, watching the city blur by, his mind replaying every memory of his grandmother, every time she had evaded his questions about his father. Was she protecting him, or was she hiding something? When they finally arrived, Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. This was it. The moment that would either shatter his world or piece it together. He glanced at Monica, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. They walked into the hospital together, two souls on the brink of a truth that would change them forever. Chapter 5. The Truth Revealed. The hospital corridors were unnervingly quiet. Daniel walked beside Monica, his heart pounding in his chest. Monica's face was pale, her eyes focused straight ahead, as if steeling herself for what lay beyond the door they were approaching. For so long he had been afraid to ask about his father, afraid to push Helen for answers she seemed unwilling to give. And now he was about to learn not just about his father, but about a mother he had never known existed. The door to Helen's room loomed before them, and with a deep breath, Daniel pushed it open. Helen lay in the bed, her face turned toward the window, looking out at a world she had grown distant from. When she heard the door open, she slowly turned her head. Her eyes widened as they landed on Monica. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. "Monica," Helen whispered, her voice frail and trembling. It was a name that carried the secret of the past she had buried. Monica stood frozen in the doorway, tears glistening in her eyes. "Helen," she managed to say, her voice cracking. "It's been a long time." Daniel looked from Monica to Helen, confusion and fear clouding his mind. You know each other? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Helen's gaze shifted to Daniel, and her eyes softened with a mixture of sorrow and love. Yes, my dear, she said, her voice trembling. We know each other. Nay, Monica took a tentative step forward. Helen, he deserves to know the truth. He deserves to know everything. A heavy silence settled over the room. Daniel felt his heart tighten, his hands cold and clammy. What truth? He demanded, his voice rising in panic. What's going on? Helen closed her eyes, taking a shaky breath. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears. Daniel, she began, her voice breaking. Andre was your father, and Monica. Monica is your mother. The words struck Daniel like a physical blow. He staggered back, his mind reeling. No, he muttered, shaking his head. No, that can't be true. It can't be. Monica moved toward him, her hands outstretched as if to comfort him, but he recoiled, his eyes wild with disbelief and anger. You knew? He shouted at Helen. You knew this whole time, and you never told me. Helen's face crumpled in anguish. I was trying to protect you, she cried. Your father, Andre, he was in trouble. He thought the only way to keep you safe was to leave. And Monica. She had no choice. I promised them I would take care of you, that I would keep you safe. I did what I thought was best. Daniel felt like the room was spinning around him. Everything he thought he knew about his life, about his family, was a lie. He had spent years grieving for a mother he thought was dead, cursing a father who had abandoned him. And now, in the span of a few minutes, he was being told that his mother was standing right in front of him. You lied to me, he choked out, tears streaming down his face. You both lied to me. Monica stepped closer, her face etched with pain. Daniel, she said softly, her voice trembling. I never wanted to leave you. I searched for you and Andre for years. I thought I'd lost you forever. I know you're angry, but please, you have to understand. I love you. I've always loved you. Daniel stared at her, his mind a whirl of emotions, anger, betrayal, confusion, and a deep, aching sadness. He wanted to hate her, to push her away, but there was something in her eyes, something in the way she spoke, that resonated with a part of him he had long since buried. I don't know you, he whispered, his voice cracking. How can you stand there and say you love me when you've been a stranger to me my whole life? Monica's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out, but stopped herself. You're right, she said, her voice trembling. I am a stranger to you, but Daniel, you're my son. And I've thought about you every single day. I want to make up for all the years we lost. The days that followed Monica, Daniel, and Helen found themselves caught in the delicate act of rebuilding what had been broken. At first, their conversations were stilted, punctuated by long pauses as they struggled to bridge the gap that years of secrets had carved between them. Monica stayed in the small town, renting a room nearby so she could be close to them. Every day she would come to the hospital, bringing with her small offerings of coffee for Helen, a book for Daniel, or simply the warmth of her presence. There were moments when Daniel would glance at her, a question lingering in his eyes, a question he could not yet bring himself to voice. Helen watched them both with a mixture of relief and sorrow. She knew that what she had done had been out of love, a fierce, protective love that had driven her to make choices she now knew were not hers to make. And now all she could do was sit back and hope that this family could find a way to heal. The days that followed Monica, Daniel, and Helen found themselves caught in the delicate act of rebuilding what had been broken. At first, their conversations were stilted, punctuated by long pauses as they struggled to bridge the gap that years of secrets had carved between them. Monica stayed in the small town, renting a room nearby so she could be close to them. Every day she would come to the hospital, bringing with her small offerings of coffee for Helen, a book for Daniel, or simply the warmth of her presence. There were moments when Daniel would glance at her, a question lingering in his eyes, a question he could not yet bring himself to voice. Helen watched them both with a mixture of relief and sorrow. She knew that what she had done had been out of love, a fierce, protective love that had driven her to make choices she now knew were not hers to make. And now all she could do was sit back and hope that this family could find a way to heal. "Daniel," Monica said one afternoon, her voice soft but steady as they sat by Helen's bedside. "I know it's going to take time. I don't expect everything to be okay overnight. But I want you to know I'm here. I'm not going anywhere this time." He looked at her, his gaze steady but cautious. "I want to believe that," he replied slowly. "I really do. But it's hard to just flip a switch and feel something that I've never had the chance to feel before." Monica nodded, her eyes welling up. "I understand," she said quietly. "But maybe we can start small, just getting to know each other, one day at a time?" He hesitated, the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. And then he nodded. "Yeah," he murmured. "One day at a time." With her financial means, Monica took on the responsibility of arranging Helen's surgery. For the first time in his life, he felt a kind of relief, knowing that Helen would receive the care she needed, knowing that the burden was no longer his alone to bear. The day of the surgery approached quickly. Daniel sat by Helen's bed the night before, his hands wrapped around hers. She looked up at him, her eyes tired but full of love. "You don't have to worry about me anymore," she whispered. "You've been so strong, Daniel, stronger than I ever hoped you'd have to be." He swallowed hard, his throat tight. I couldn't lose you, Grandma. I had to do something." She smiled faintly. "And you did, sweetheart. You did more than anyone could have asked of you." Monica stood in the doorway, watching the exchange with a lump in her throat. She had missed so many moments like this, moments that could never be recaptured. But watching them now, she felt a sliver of hope that perhaps they could create new moments, new memories. The surgery took place the next morning. Monica and Daniel sat side by side in the waiting room, an unspoken bond of worry holding them together. Hours passed, each one stretching on interminably. When the doctor finally came out, his expression calm and reassuring, they both exhaled in relief. "The surgery went well," he informed them. "Helen will need time to recover, but she's going to be fine." Daniel felt a weight lift off his chest, his eyes closing as he let out a shaky breath. Monica squeezed his hand, her own eyes brimming with tears of relief. In the days that followed, Daniel returned to the Villa Churrasco grill. But this time, as he stepped onto the stage, he was not the same boy who had sung out of sheer desperation. He was not singing to escape, to earn money, to grasp at a shred of hope in a world that felt like it was closing in on him. With Helen's surgery behind them, life began to shift into a new rhythm. Monica now found herself stepping into the role of a mother. She was there for Daniel, making breakfast together, helping him with his schoolwork, talking about his dreams. "Daniel," she said one morning as they sat at the kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the window. "Have you thought about what you want to do now? With your music, I mean." Daniel, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I still want to sing," he admitted. But I also want to go back to school properly. Maybe learn more about music, like how to write songs, how to play instruments." Monica's heart swelled with pride. He had grown so much in these past few months. She said with a smile, "We'll find a way for you to do both." She supported him in ways that went beyond just paying for lessons or school fees. She was there, fully present in his life, giving him the unconditional love. It wasn't easy for either of them. There were moments when the wounds of the past made their presence known. But each day, they learned a little more about each other, learned to trust in the fragile but growing bond that was forming between them. For Daniel, he was no longer the boy carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, fighting against a future that seemed to be slipping through his fingers. He moved into Monica's house with Helen, where the three of them began to build a semblance of normalcy. He would feel the warmth of their presence around him, Monica's soft footsteps down the hall, Helen's gentle snoring in the next room, and he knew he was not alone. After Helen's recovery, Richard and Julia often visited, their presence bringing a sense of extended family to Daniel's new world. With Richard's guidance, Daniel began to explore more facets of music, songwriting, composing, even learning the piano. Julia had seen Daniel at his lowest, had helped him sneak out of the orphanage night after night. And now, to see him surrounded by family, supported and loved, filled her with a quiet joy. As they spent more time together, helping Daniel with his music, sharing meals, laughing over stories, the bond between Julia and Richard deepened. The evening of the special performance arrived with an air of quiet excitement. Villa Churrasco Grill had never been so full, the tables filled with familiar faces and some new ones too. This wasn't just another performance, it was a celebration, a culmination of everything Daniel had worked for and all that he had become. Daniel stood backstage, looking out at the audience through a small gap in the curtains. He saw them sitting together in the front row, Monica, Helen, Richard, and Julia. Each of them had played a part in this journey. Each of them had helped him carve out a place in the world. Tonight was as much for them as it was for him. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice echoing through the room. "Tonight isn't just about music. It's about gratitude. It's about the people who stood by me when I had nothing else to hold on to." He glanced at Monica, who smiled up at him with tears in her eyes. "My mother," he continued, his voice catching slightly on the word, "who fought to find me when all seemed lost. My grandmother who raised me with love and taught me the value of perseverance. Richard, who gave me a stage when I needed one the most. And Julia, who believed in me even when the odds were stacked against us." He glanced at Monica again, and then at the rest of his family. "Forgiveness isn't easy," he said softly, his voice cracking just a bit. "It takes time, it takes patience, but it's the only way to truly move forward. We can't change the past, but we can choose to build a future together." The room was utterly silent. This was more than a performance. When the final note hung in the air, there was a moment of stillness before the room erupted into applause. Daniel opened his eyes. Monica was crying, her hands clasped together, her eyes never leaving him. Richard and Julia were standing, their faces shining with pride. After the performance, people came up to him, offering words of praise, but it was the faces of his family that he sought in the crowd. "You did good, kid," Richard said, clapping him on the shoulder. Monica hugged him tightly, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Daniel." Daniel stood by the window that evening, looking out at the stars. Life had a way of taking unexpected turns, but it also had a way of bringing you exactly where you needed to be. He had found his place, not just on the stage, but in the hearts of those who loved him. And as he looked at the sky, he knew that no matter what the future held, he would face it with the strength and love of the family that stood by his side. In the days that followed, they began to talk about the future. There were plans to be made: school, music, life. Thank you for taking the time to read Daniel's heartwarming story. If there's one thing this story reminds us of, it's the power of love, patience, and forgiveness. No matter how many hardships you've been through, or how challenging the road ahead may be, the love and unity of family can always help us overcome it all. If you find this story inspiring, please share it with your loved ones and friends. Remember, we are never alone in our journey of life. There are always people who love and support us. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on the next meaningful stories. Let's spread the message of love and hope together. Thank you for being with me for the past 10 years, and I look forward to the next wonderful journey with you. See you in the next video.